So let's get this started. So recapping. So we went over chapter 3 last week. So remember chapter 1, we talked about sort of the lay of the land. What is the attention economy? How did we get here? Chapter 2, we talked about sort of the impossibility of escape. We talked about the history of the commune movement and reactionary politics that gave us Nixon and later Reagan, and how those have sort of created the landscape that we find ourselves in. And now in chapter 3, we talked about sort of the impossibility of escape. That actually seeing participation as black and white, as in you are either fully participating or fully withdrawn from society, is an immature response that is drawn from desperation, and that actually sort of finding ways to resist in place is the suggestion that Odell brings up. And so in chapter 4, we try to get into that idea more so and try to dissect it. Like, what does resistance actually look like? And that was sort of what I was left with at the end of chapter 3. It's like, cool, you're talking about these third spaces, you're talking about resistance as this idea that sounds really cool, but at the same time, what does that actually mean substantively? What does it mean to resist? Oh no, Mercury, you are good. I'm just getting started here. Let's see. So in chapter 4, what do we actually start off with? Like I said, it kicks off with a little bit of art, a discussion of modern art specifically, and some of my favorite pieces of modern art, actually, or my favorite schools of modern art. And tries to really draw art, and particularly conceptual art, as a vehicle to explain resistance to the attention economy and what that actually looks like. And then it gets into a whole lot of social psychology, which, as some of you know, I am a doctor of social psychology. Like I said, I actually know some of the people that are mentioned in this chapter, which is really cool and kind of surreal to be like, oh yeah, they're important. I remember now. Which also means I have strong opinions about some of the language that was used in this chapter. And I want to address a couple of things and have a couple of creative tangents that I think are very useful if you're going to talk about, like, you ever going to use the word unconscious. That means a lot of things, and people use it all the time, and it does not mean the things that they think it means. So we're going to talk about that for a bit. But first, we really got to talk about Cate Blanchett. She's great. She's wonderful. Phenomenal talent. But specifically, I want to talk about one piece that she is extraordinarily central to. A presentation that personally keyed me into and made me appreciate modern art. And that is Manifesto. It's an art film by Julian Roosevelt that was later on turned into a art institute installation at the Hirshhorn in Washington, D.C., which is where I had the opportunity to see this. So what is Manifesto? It is an art film where Cate Blanchett narrates excerpts from different artistic manifestos. These are actual sort of manifesto documents from different artists conceptualizing themselves as part of different movements, whether that's in conceptual art, modern art, Dadaism, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but then going through, or even up to brutalism, I believe actually has a segment. But every portion of it is a different skit, a different manifesto that's woven into a different narrative where Cate Blanchett plays a different character. As a film, it's kind of cool, and I actually have the trailer that I think I can show without getting DMCA'd. It actually, I went through a pretty sizable portion of this art institute installation before I realized that every one of these characters was Cate Blanchett. It's she is truly a chameleon here. But I'm going to play a couple excerpts from the trailer just to kind of set the stage for what this piece actually is. And then I want to talk about art in space. So oh, you're getting silence. Oh, that makes sense, actually. Give me 1 second, and thank you for letting me know. I screwed that one up. Give me 1 second to catch the computer audio. Let's see. And by default. Yes. Okay, that should be working now. Huh. Oh, I think I realized what's going on here. All right. 1 second. Technical difficulties are VTuber culture. Please forgive me. As whoop! That's why you forget for getting turned on Nova syndrome. I am a professional streamer. What? All right. My God. You would think that everything would just be easy, but of course nothing ever is. All right, let's give it a shot now. Really? It has to happen at least once per stream. That's how you know that it's a real. You're doing well. Let's see if I do this and change this to properties and change this to headphones.
Inspiration and fuels your imagination. Okay.
All right. I think. Okay, I got it. Finally worked it out. There we go.
In my glorious isolation, I am illuminated by the marvelous incandescence of my electrically charged nerves.
I should get a little bit earlier in this, just so we get a better taste for it. I also love this piece. And it's my stream. Kate Blanchett is unbelievable in this. I can do a whole stream talking about how good this film is.
All that is solid melts into air. To put out a manifesto, you must want ABC to fulminate against 1, 2, 3.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. All current art is fake.
I know, striking, right? All art is fake.
Move and board, and we are forever making new discoveries. To the electric chair with shotgun. Nothing is original, okay? So you can steal from anywhere that resonates with inspiration and fuels your imagination, okay?
Well, there we go. You get the idea. Basically, it's a series of vignettes where, again, Kate Blanchett, playing these different characters, situates herself, and the way that this is portrayed, though, in the actual installation is that instead of it being a continuous film that goes from vignette to vignette to vignette, each of the individual vignettes is set up to loop across the exhibition hall on different screens. And the acoustics of the room are set up such that as you're sitting in front of one of the screens, you generally hear the audio from that one. But as you move between them, what you start to realize is that you're hearing all of these various conversations that are happening. And in fact, they've been looped together and placed in such a way that you'll hear call and response between different vignettes. You'll realize that maybe they're saying the same thing. There are parts of the film where Kate Blanchett will start to sing her words instead of speaking them. And then the way this is set up, you start to hear that, and you see this is not only singing in this one vignette, it is singing alongside another piece that happens later in the film when it's synced together. And they're saying the same words, and they're actually, it's incredible, it's disorienting, it's beautiful. I was dizzy when I left this installation for the first time, because it's just, it's a feast of attention. You're trying to pay attention to one screen, you see things happening on another one, you're surrounded by Kate Blanchett. She's using different voices, she's in different costumes. It's incredible. If you ever have a chance to see Manifesto, do it. It's great. But what am I really getting at here? I want to talk about art as a means of resistance and art as a tension. And to do that, we need to talk about Dadaism. What Dadaism is a art movement, particularly situated within conceptual art. It's related to Cubism and a lot of what we consider to be sort of modern or weird art, so to speak, if you want to put it quite simply. And what it's rooted in is the idea of groups of artists finding themselves dissatisfied with the ideals of capitalism and its infiltration into artistic spaces. And so they built up a school of art that is film, that is music, that is performance, that is dance, that they called Dada, which rejected capitalism and the tenets of capitalism within these artistic environments and embraced nonsense, that is to say. And one of the most infamous pieces of Dadaism is Fountain by Marcel Duchamp, which is basically shitposting. It's literally a urinal. But the story behind this art is really remarkable. So at the time, there was a art exhibit being set up with the tenet that it was supposed to exhibit all of the different facets of modern art, and anything that was presented or was submitted to be included in the exhibit would be included. At the time, Duchamp was actually on the board of this exhibit, and basically trolling and trying to make a point, took this urinal, wrote R. Mutt 1917 on it, and submitted it for this exhibition. And it kicked off a flurry of, it is basically absurdist memes of the past. It kicked off a flurry of conversation about what is art? What are the boundaries of art? How do we determine what is and is not an artistic expression? And during the actual exhibition, Fountain was suppressed. They kind of hid it away because they didn't know what to do with it. But in doing so, Duchamp actually made the point that he wanted to, which is in the theme and the narrative of chapter 3. Remember with Diogenes, the original asshole who told Alexander the Great to get out of his son? I will participate, but not as asked. In this case, in this rejection of capitalism, Dada and Dadaist artists were able to, if not intentionally, but it seems sometimes even intentionally, cultivate and craft a third space wherein they were able to challenge definitions and challenge the values of capitalism that they saw as monopolistic and destructive to the art that they were trying to create. And so Fountain doesn't actually exist anymore. It only exists in photograph at this point, at least I believe. Correct me on I'm not an art historian. But its impact is still felt. Because even now, how many of you have ever heard someone say, modern art, that sucks? I was one of those people for a very long time. I would look at stuff like Fountain and be like, how is that art? I don't understand. But now I think I'm starting to get it more. And that's kind of the point, to ask that question. What is art? What is the purpose of this? Does it have to even have a purpose in order for it to be considered art? These are important questions. And also, as Raina hit, not only is it a rejection of capitalism, Dadaism, particularly in Central and Western Europe, was formulated as a response to Nazism, in particular in a response to the violence of World War II. It was in a sort of the embrace of nonsense and absurdity was the artists, in some cases, seeing themselves as being connected to a world that felt absurd to them. Following World War II, how could anything ever make sense again? But that's a conversation for an art history lecture, so please look forward to the next iteration of the Ricky Reading series, where we will talk about true absurdism and the histories of modern art. Now, in her writing, Odell particularly points out one piece, and that's John Cage's 433, which I actually have an excerpt of. I'm going to chance the copyright laws on this one. I might get DMCA'd, but you know what? It's worth it for the pursuit of knowledge. So let's see what happens.
And now, a performance of John Cage's 433. Please welcome our soloist, William Marks.
Exceptional, just truly exceptional. This shit rules. Right? This is great. This is art. So, as you might have, yeah, the drop is coming. This is on the original dubstep track. As you might have imagined, 433 is an absurdist musical piece that has the same sort of general dynamic as Fountain. Ooh, so good. So fucking good. What is music? So in 433, the point of this presentation is that the pianist doesn't play anything. He gets up and he sits for a full 3 movements. And Odell talks about being able to witness a performance of this piece, which was at all times exhilarating and disorienting. Because what is it? What is the actual music here? The music or the presentation is really all based in the noises of the concert hall. Usually, if you see music, if you see live music, the performer is what's attracting your attention, right? But this inverts it. In fact, it directs the audience's attention back on themselves. In the quiet concert hall with the exceptional acoustics, you can hear a pin drop. You can hear people breathing. You can hear someone coughing. And for a full 3 movements of music, the pianist sits there in silence. And it's a controversial piece. I think it's a beautiful piece and really wonderful in its absurdity. So Odell talks about going to see this performance and then experiencing what she calls the unmooring. And that is to say that she feels much like a ship detached from its mooring and drifting out to sea, that being in this, having her attention directed and redirected like that, was a shift in perspective that changed the way that she related to the world around her. So she later points to another piece of art film known as The Exchange with Aaron Colleran, wherein a person, an actor in the film, a relatively short film, experiences an event that causes their perception to shift, and then they start to, through the rest of the film, interact with novelty and absurdity to otherwise very mundane situations. Which is to say, and to evidence, that perceptual shifts, experiences that cause us to change the way that we think about the world and the way that it is structured, will cause us to perhaps interact with the world differently. That there is a power in perception, and that by changing our perception of a thing, we can in fact change the way that that thing exists to us in the world. And this falls along the lines that Adele uses the language of I, it, and I, thou. So to say I, it is to recognize a thing or to observe a thing only insofar as it is a means to an end. So if I were to look at, let's say, a VTuber, and I were to say and I were to observe it as I, it, or to observe them as I, it, I might see them as an entertainer, as something to consume. Whereas I see that if I recognize or relate to that person, maybe the cool deer that you are watching right now, with the perspective of I, thou, I might understand that, this person is putting on a well-researched and wonderful lecture, that they've put a lot of effort into this, and that there is a multitude of different perspectives and ways that I could appreciate what I am observing. There is a person that is animating that character. There are artists that produce that produce this model, and so on and so forth. I think the example that Odell uses in the book, much like almost everything else in the book, is a tree. If you look at a tree and you think about it as, this is something that can be useful to me. It is a hot summer day. It's casting shade. I can sit there. That's great. But if you think about something from the perspective, again, of I, thou, you might think about, wow, I wonder how long this tree has been here. Who planted it? Did they have an intention for it while it was planted? Maybe there's some birds that live in it. Maybe you can think about what is its role in the ecosystem that it exists in, and so on and so forth. It's an intense rabbit hole that you can fall down. But what it does, by trying to shift to this I, thou perspective, a person also is able to externalize and shift their attention away from the rote that we become accustomed to, which is to, at a low level, interact with things insofar as they can be useful to us as a means to an end. Get it? That's kind of the crux of this whole chapter. It's to really talk about attention, and particular things that we can do about attention and its relationship to perception. And as much as I do enjoy art, I am not an artist. I am fundamentally a psychologist. In fact, not just so much fundamentally, I am literally a psychologist. I am a doctor of social psychology. And at this point, the writing shifts more into things that are definitely more on my lane, in particular the use of language between hearing versus listening, or seeing versus observing. So when we think about hearing and seeing, these are biological processes. It's just something that happens. You can have things that are occurring in your visual field, or are actually sounds that are resonating in your cochlea and are being transduced as electrical signals into your brain. But you don't necessarily hear them. You don't necessarily attend to them. And our perception is a mix of the actual biological processes that we experience as we interact with our environments, coupled with our construal of those sensations and how we make sense of them in our upper level of cognition, which can lead to what we call inattention blindness. So you might have ever had a situation, perhaps, where maybe you're editing your slides before you go in and give your big VTuber lecture, and you don't realize that you have missing words. And then you ask your wonderful girlfriend if she's willing to look at your slides, and she immediately points out that you have a lot of typos and some missing words. Well, as you're going through and editing and looking through things, your attention might actually be directed to other things. You're thinking about what's it going to be like to actually perform this? How long is this going to take? And those other questions are distracting you from actually realizing that maybe what you're reading on the page isn't necessarily what is written there. And there is a classic experiment in social psychology. I show it in all of my classes whenever I teach this, that I've actually probably even shown this on stream before. But this is a famous frame wherein, as part of an experiment, researchers bring people into the lab. They show them a group of two different people. Some are wearing the black shirts, some are wearing the white shirts, and they are passing a ball back and forth. And the experimenter says, all right, it's really important. We're doing an experiment on attention. I want you to keep track of every time that a person in a white shirt passes the ball to someone in a white shirt, and someone with a black shirt passes the ball to someone in a black shirt. Of course, it's all bullshit. It's just to distract the person. Tell them that there's going to be a reward, or like if as close as they are to the actual number, they might get paid more for the experiment, so on and so forth, giving them some kind of incentive. And then while the person is so fixated on who's passing the ball to whom, a person in a gorilla suit walks into the middle of the circle, bangs their chest, jumps around, and then walks off screen. And so the person sits down and they say, well, I was very intent and I was very studious, and you know what? I kept track. There were 10 passes total between a person in a white shirt and a white shirt and a black shirt and a black shirt. Then the experimenter looks at them and says, yeah, but what about the gorilla? Did you see the gorilla? And most of the time, and this has been replicated quite extensively, conceptually and exactly, people don't see the gorilla. Even though it's registering in their visual field. It is the light is reflecting off the screen, it is being processed in their brain. Because they are not actually paying attention to the actual stimuli of the gorilla, they don't register it. It doesn't occur that it's even there. They don't even log it in their memory that even happened. And then when the experimenter asks them, even moments later, yeah, did you see that really weird thing that happened? They have no idea most of the time. It's quite funny. There's another example that the book gives where there's a grid. So it's just, two lines, X and Y axis. And they say, hey, we're going to show you a picture in the upper right quadrant of this grid, and we want you to be able to identify what that is. So the person now, their attention has been directed to the upper right portion of the screen, right? Well, then they start flashing people in the lower left, where they aren't attending to that information. They might start flashing words, either words or just randomized chunks of letters, and then they ask someone afterwards, do you remember seeing anything else on any other part of the screen? And it depends really on the stimulus. People have an easier time categorizing meaningful words, and versus like the word Jack versus like JCFK doesn't register in the same way. But by and large, the general trend is that even though it is registering in their visual field, there are circumstances where if our attention is directed otherwhere, like somewhere else, we don't even realize that we're looking at it, right? I think everyone's got anecdotal like, anecdotal experiences where this has happened to them. And this is another experiment that I'm a big fan of. I love the history of very famous social psychology is basically pranking people and then asking them if they knew that they were being pranked. It's kind of funny. And an extension of inattention blindness, yeah, if only they'd learned how to look at the screen, right? This is actually why, if you want to relate this to video games and fighting games, inattention blindness is why people get hit by 30 frame overheads. You were paying attention to something else and it slowed your reaction speed. Oh. So change blindness is an extension of inattention blindness. In this experiment, a Confederate, or that is to say, someone who's in on the joke, comes up to a person on a college campus and starts asking them for directions. Hey, I'm a new student here. I'm trying to get to my class. I'm running late. Do you know where the chemistry building is? And now if you're like me and you worked on a college campus for any point, you are terrified because you know where Panda Express is and the psychology building, and you have no idea where the chemistry building is. But you want to help this person out, so you're racking your brain, you maybe take your phone out, you're looking up on the map, you're trying to figure out where on earth is the chemistry building. Now, while you're doing all of this, these two fine folks walk by with a door. And they walk right between you, and while they're doing that, the person that you were talking to switches places with one of these other people, and then they just continue the conversation. And then afterwards, someone comes up to them and says, hey, do you even realize that the person that you started this conversation with and the person you ended this conversation with are different? Most people don't recognize that they are talking to a completely different person because of the processes of attention. They're thinking about where this other building is on campus. They're not thinking about who they were talking to. And in some conceptualizations of this experiment, they were able to get this effect even when the person changed like ethnicity, when the person changed gender or presentation. And it's like even in very major changes, the person like that they are talking to, the actual subject of the experiment, doesn't realize what is going on. You've also probably, even if you didn't know the term for it, come across the cocktail party effect. That is to say that if you are kind of in a room and maybe you're attending to different information, all of a sudden you might perk up when something comes up that you recognize. In particular, the classic example is you hear someone say your name, and then you immediately realize and key into and are able to focus into that particular conversation, even if you weren't listening to them before. So I might be at the cool VTuber panel at a convention, and someone I'm kind of zoned out, maybe a little bit hungover, as you know, as is convention culture. And all of a sudden, I hear someone say, you know, Ricky Hirsch is like the coolest and the greatest, you know, professional psychology VTuber around. And immediately, boom, I hear it and I am listening to them, even if they're across the room, across the convention center either, because my ears are quite large. So in some, brains are weird. This is actually the what I ended up with. I went and all the way to grad school. I got a doctorate in psychology. And this is basically what I came away with. Our brains are weird and dumb. And we end up taking in far more information than we can ever meaningfully process. It's wild, right? And we can remain, however, even if we cannot meaningfully process all that information at the same time, we are generally aware of information at some level, evidenced by the cocktail party effect. Even if we were not totally ignorant, or if we were totally ignorant of this information, it wouldn't matter, right? You're going to hear this thing, you're going to hear it across the room, you zoom in on it, you know what's going on all of a sudden. How wild is that, right? Like, our brains are so intricately complex that we are maybe even not aware that we are attending to information all the time, and at the same time can also completely screw up and drop the ball on being able to pay attention to things that are happening right in front of us. Part of the reason for this is that you've probably heard of short-term memory, you've probably heard of long-term memory, but let me tell you about sensory memory. That is to say, our immediate fraction of a second experience of the world that is coming in through all of our five senses at any given moment. If we attend to the information that is coming in through our, exactly, a new memory, it just dropped. I just invented it right now. It's the power of VTubing. It's already been updated into your brain. By attending to information that is coming in through our sentences, we're able to move that into short-term memory. The information that we rehearse ends up in long-term memory that can then be brought back and retrieved over time. And the information that we don't attend to, or we don't process deeply enough to form into long-term memory, is ultimately forgotten. So when we think about attention, it's very important here. And we're thinking about, again, kind of pulling back to into the book, we're going to talk about the attention economy later on. During psychedelic experiences, I will talk about that stuff later on. I actually have to think about that one. I'm actually not quite an expert on the, I guess, the neurochemical nature of psychedelic experiences. From anecdotally, from listening to people, generally, it depends, again, kind of on their ability to attend and their ability to rehearse and recall that information later on. So it develops the same general guidelines. But by and large, kind of thinking about this here, attention in the attention economy focuses on the monetization and the capitalization on directing and redirecting people's ability to attend to the information that's coming in front of them. And there are some really important consequences that I think we'll get into a little bit later. But by and large, I just think that this is really neat. It's a cool way to think about the world. I always love teaching Psych 101, or especially Social Psych 101. Because I get to go over all these fun little experiments, and you see your students really light up, and they're just like, wow, that happened to me. You know, I was just like not paying attention, and someone said my name, and I heard them from across the room, and then they start to recognize that a lot of the things that are happening in their brains and in their daily experiences are related to the stuff in the class, and then all of a sudden they care. And if they make poor life choices like me, they care too much and they become doctors. And then they end up becoming VTubers that talk about this on the internet. So let's get into some of, I guess, the criticisms I have of some of the things that Odell brings up. I guess I can't criticize someone who's not really versed in this information, but one of the biggest pet peeves, the biggest pet peeve I have about the way that people talk about psychological research is that there is not a hard line between conscious and unconscious processing. So you think about this traditional dichotomy here, if we want to like think about this in terms of these freaking icebergs, these awful memes. These draw a hard line. So at the top of here, you've got the conscious mind, which is there's a small portion of the mind that is obvious to us. And that is true at some level. You know, we're only able to attend to so much information. But this harsh line that there is a subconscious mind that is like 95% of our brain, but we can't necessarily attend to it, it doesn't really work that way, right? Because if this dichotomy was real, then stuff like the cocktail party effect wouldn't work. Because things that are inaccessible, that we're not attending to, are not going to be able to enter our conscious mind unless we're actively attending to them. And yet, even if we don't consciously direct our attention towards something, it can still pop up like that. Yeah, a lot of it is parallel processing with some gray area in there. But by and large, yeah, it's we're basically taking in information, processing as much as we can. We have some conscious control over what we attend to, but in some cases, we also have a less conscious, I like more or less, more so than hard lines, less conscious processes that are also going and operating on the information that we're taking in, so that if something does happen in our environment that we do need to be aware of, we then can shift our attention without necessarily having it be an effortful process to attend to that. If you want to hear me rail about that more while I'm like a little drunk and a little bit less professional, there's a cool video on my YouTube channel where a chatting stream turned into me yelling about how much I hate the Myers-Briggs. So just plugging my own content. I've been told that that's how you grow as a creator. It turns out you have to tell people to watch the things that you make in order to get people to watch them. Totally novel process. I had no idea. So like I said, I'm more of a fan of things being more or less conscious, more or less aware. Because like I said, if things were totally unconscious, then we wouldn't be able to introspect to them. We wouldn't be able to direct our attention to them because they are totally outside of our awareness. Now, one of the areas where I think that it's very important, and where I also think that this line gets blurred a lot, and by a lot I mean a lot, and by a lot I mean this drove me up a wall in grad school because I would get comments from reviewers that would ask me to address this piece that does not ultimately exist, right? It's great. If you're familiar with academic publishing, the idea is that you write your manuscript, you submit it to a journal, it goes past the editor. If the editor says this looks kind of cool after their brief read through, then they send it to a series of reviewers that are ostensibly experts in that area, but it doesn't necessarily work out that way. And so I would end up having to oftentimes argue with so-called experts or people that were fluent with this area about the minutia of the word unconscious. And I got very tired of it very quickly. But within this world of unconscious bias, you may have heard the term implicit bias at some point. I pulled this definition from the National Center of Cultural Competence, and that is to say, and they define these terms as, in the case of explicit or conscious, the person is very clear about his or her feelings and attitudes, and related behaviors are conducted with intent. Implicit or unconscious bias operates outside of the person's awareness and can be in direct contradiction to a person's espoused beliefs or values. I hate this. Particularly, I mean, it makes sense when we're thinking about explicit cognition, or conscious cognition as they want to call it. I won't use those terms. That there is a large portion of our beliefs, our attitudes, our behaviors that we are aware of and we can readily report. And then there's some things that either people tend to be hesitant or, like in my term, lost it. There it is. All right. An implicit attitude to me, or an implicit cognition, is a rehearsed association between concepts and memory that a person is either unwilling or unable to report. It's a more complicated definition, but I want to really point out one thing here. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person is unaware that they have an attitude. So this gets brought up a lot in the concept of unconscious racial bias or implicit racial bias. So this idea that people are not aware that they maybe have some unfortunate opinions about African Americans or different ethnic or racial groups. But it doesn't really work out that cleanly. Very often people are aware they have these attitudes, they just don't want to say that they do, because there are social pressures to appear egalitarian. In fact, actually, when you anonymize your research, you would be shocked at the amount of stuff that people are willing to say when they feel like it's not going to come back to them. Yeah, and like Raina said, so there are two ways to measure this. Either you rely on self-report and you just ask people, hey, do you have this opinion? And then you run into the problem when it's a socially desirable attitude, like being egalitarian, where people are not going to report that they have racial prejudices or biases, in most cases. So as researchers, we end up turning to what we call indirect measures. Get it? Direct, indirect, it's very complicated. The most iconic of which, or at least the one that I have the most confidence in, is the implicit association test, which measures, after a series of training blocks, the relative speed and accuracy through which a person can sort different categories and stimuli, or adjectives. So in this case, this is the race IAT. So you take pictures of very prototypically African American faces, very prototypically Caucasian faces, and you pair those, after learning with people, with either good words or bad words. And then the stimuli shows up in the center of the screen, and the person either uses usually two keys on their keyboard, either the E or the I or the left or right arrow or whatever works, to correctly identify where that stimuli belongs. So let's say in this case here in the upper right, you get an African American face or a bad word, you put it in the left side. If you get the European American or Caucasian face in the good word, you put it in the right side. And then after a series of trials, the categories flip. And then you look at the relative speed and accuracy. So the first pairings are randomized, so there's no real order effects. And then after the trial is done, depending on how a person is able to their relative speed or accuracy, they're assigned a relative score that says, hey, you find it easy, like, you had an easier time when, as most people find out, the European or Caucasian faces and good were paired together relative to when they were paired with the bad words, and vice versa. What does that ultimately mean? Well, it means a lot of things. I think that in some cases, researchers have hurt the science by overselling and overpromising what these things actually are. Really, what I take it as, and I guess what you would call in the literature an associationist. What it says is that a person has an easier time associating these things. The consequences for downstream behavior are harder to talk about. They're going to depend on a lot of different variables. And also, this isn't all of a sudden assigning a number to somebody and saying, hey, you had an easier time with the, black bad, white good pairing. That doesn't necessarily mean that the person is necessarily racist. What it's saying is perhaps you grew up in a settler colonial country where these pairings have been drilled into you since you were a child, and you've got some baggage there to work out. It's a very complicated measure. It's people have tried to knock it for decades. I want to say the first paper with it was published in I want to say it was the mid to late 90s. So it's been about 20 years of people extensively researching indirect measures and what they mean, and the jury is still kind of out. But it suffice to say they do mean something. I can talk more about it later if people are interested, but it's something that gets brought up. They were talking about the implicit bias trainings, and I really wanted to really hammer out kind of how I approach it, because I've spent way too many hours listening to people talk about implicit associations and what they mean and what their consequences are. All right. So the important bit, though, is when we're talking about implicit attitudes, think about the cocktail party effect. You hear someone say your name across the room and you can suddenly attend to it, which means that it's not totally non-conscious. And that's something that's important when we're talking about implicit biases and their relationship with behavior, because if they were not consciously accessible, if these really were unconscious attitudes or unconscious feelings, then the kinds of bias trainings and interventions that Odell writes about wouldn't make any sense, right? And one of the things that Patricia Devine and her lab talk about is sort of catching and confronting. That is to say that when most people have sort of a gut feeling, they can usually consciously introspect it. And so one of the pieces that they talk about is that since these are consciously accessible, most people are aware that they have these kinds of associations, and one of the ways to correct them, if you don't like having them, is to exercise your attention directed inward and catch and reverse some of catch and reverse these gut level associations as you notice them. As far as I'm aware, so the question is, how would the bias test still work on neurodivergent people? Neurodivergent is a big label. Given that it's largely a measure of reaction time, more so than anything else, I would imagine it would still work. I'm not aware of any research that is looking at the consequences or correlates of these kinds of measures, looking specifically at neurodivergent populations. But anecdotally, I would imagine that they would probably still function in the same way, just insofar as that they're measures of reaction speed. So anyway, it sounds hard, right? You're going through life, you're experiencing the world, you're having these sort of gut level associations. Actually, that's kind of a way that I have explained implicit attitudes to students before. You ever get a gut feeling about something? You can't quite place it. You're not quite sure where it came from, but it's there. It's not even necessarily a verbal feeling. It's not like I am feeling this because of this. It's like I just got a bad feeling, or I got a good feeling about this. That's kind of a hunch, is a good way of thinking about a implicit attitude. And I've done some research where I've looked at people's implicit association test scores and their gut reaction. So we just said, hey, what's your opinion here? 1 to 5. What's your opinion? What's your gut opinion? Like, don't even think about it. Just pick the number. And then we looked at how those all hung together in terms of correlation, or how related they were. And we found that actually people's implicit association test scores, or IoT scores, were actually pretty well correlated with their self-reported gut reaction. So there's I think some merit there if you're looking for a shorthand. And I just said a lot of words, and you're like, I don't understand what the hell you just said. You just think about it like a gut feeling. But, you can catch and say, hey, I don't know why I have this gut feeling. It doesn't make sense for me to have it. I'm just going to ignore it, right? You can use your attentional process to either go with your gut or not. And I really actually liked this particular spot in Odell's writing, that attention, when we think about attention, it's not a one and done. You don't say, haha, I'm going to attend to this thing, and then it's good. In fact, attention is a complicated series of successful efforts to continually direct and maintain our attention on a particular something. So if you are like me, I actually have have had attention issues my whole life. It's frustrating to see the depictions of attention, like in some media, how attention deficit is talked about. It's like, oh, look, I'm so random. Aha, squirrel. I hate that kind of stuff, because for me, what attention deficit looks like is that sometimes I have executive dysfunction, and it's really hard to sit down and focus on something, even if it's something that I want to do. My guitars have been collecting dust in the corner because it's hard for me to get the attention together to say, hey, I'm going to go play guitar, even though I know I want to do it. Because getting the attention together and then holding my attention on that task is sometimes really difficult. And Odell connects then attention to willpower. That is to say, our ability to direct our own attention, our ability to think about what we are attending to, and control what particular physical sensations we're thinking about in the given moment, is by and large an effort of will. But now we're going to bring it into the attention economy, right? That's the whole point of this reading series. There's a lot of money to be made in being able to direct people's attention, aka to subvert or direct their willpower. And in doing so, sorry, I had to take a sippy quickly there. I've been talking for like almost an hour now. There we go. There is, by extension, a lot of money, $1 billion with a B dollar industry built around undermining a person's ability to self-direct. And the constant influx of distractions that we experience day in and day out impair us from being able to do what we really want to do. Think about targeted ads, for example. How many of you, show of hands, I can't raise my hands because they aren't rigged that way, but have experienced this kind of sensation where you're just getting pounded with ads all the time, and then you see it, you're like, oh man, where am I going to go for lunch? I'm hungry. You see an ad like, hey, Wendy's, and you're like, I guess I'll go to Wendy's. That's the attention economy. Inundating people with signals, making it hard for them to parse and control what they are or are not attending to, and then sliding in to direct their action toward either maybe clicking a link, maybe buying a product, so on and so on and so on. So there's been a long, long history of research on this kind of stuff. We call it persuasion. And Robert Levine, who I actually just learned in the process of writing this, passed away recently, wrote a book at one point called The Power of Persuasion. So what did Levine do? Levine went on a radical sabbatical. That is, basically you tell your university you're going to go do something out in the world and it has scientific merit. And Levine's decision was to study used car salesmen. So for a week, Levine worked with used car salesmen and interviewed them on the different techniques that they use to get people to buy cars that they otherwise would not have bought. And in this book, documents techniques like the foot in the door in the face, anchoring, lowballing, so on and so forth. You've probably heard all of these terms before. If you've ever done any kind of research in marketing or you're aware of any marketing literature, this is a cornerstone of that whole area of research. And if you've ever been on the internet, the science of persuasion, or the psychology of persuasion, is alive and well in the spirit of what we call UX design, or user experience. So if you're on the internet, you're playing a losing game. There are very well-paid people with a lot of degrees that are sitting down and they are tooling and retooling these websites based on experimental data that they are getting that you might not even realize that they are farming from you in order to learn how to best persuade you to do what they want. You're watching this on Twitch right now, right? Later on, you're going to be watching this on YouTube. There is an extensive amount of research on ways that you can get a person to, especially if you're, let's say, on Twitch, the primary means of monetization are subscriptions and donations. But what they want is they want you to subscribe. So you might see up in the right-hand corner of your screen, if you're a Prime member, because Amazon owns Twitch, if you click that button, there's a bunch of different things that you can get with your Prime membership. And oh, did you know that you can subscribe to somebody for free with Prime? That gets you to that directs your attention to the sub button, to the subscription button, to the subscription service, of which Amazon takes a cut via Twitch. All this is set up to get a person to direct their attention where they want, like where the company wants them to, in a way that is explicitly profitable. And if you are, again, an individual person, you're playing a losing game. The odds are very much stacked against you in much the same way Odell uses the analogy of playing chess against the computer. It's been designed for that. It's been refined and tested and retested and redesigned to beat you specifically. So if you're losing, it's a rigged game to begin with. I got a good example of this from a recent stream of mine. Let's watch the clip and then talk about it for a second. All right? Look at this nerd. Look at this huge nerd. What a loser. I think the atmosphere is set. It's time. Ume pion, ume pion, ume pion, ume pion. All right. What a nerd. Let's get it. And if not this, at least Agnes Tachyon. Agnes Tachyon shards. Fuck. Oh, no. E. Ah. Ooh. Ah. E. Ah. That's not bad. Good start. Good start. Get out of here, King Halo. Oh, yes. Love it. Love it. Keep doing this. Okay, that's whatever. Yeah, winning. I'm just winning. Oh, yeah, this is the best roll. This is the best roll. Acknowledge. What a nerd. Let's break this down. All right, so this is Uma Musume. If you watch me on Twitch, you've probably seen me stream this. I do like this game a lot. But let's be critical here for a second. So this is the primary mechanism of getting new characters and new supports in the game. You roll for them. Think about this. Let's see, can I get through here? Even from the jump, it's colorful. You've got the big buttons. You've got all this going on here. From the jump, you've already got this bit here. You can see that, oh, look, there's like the gold button here. And that's if you spend real money on the game instead of the free currency. Ume pion, ume pion, ume pion, ume pion. My God, I can't believe that's what I sound like. I need to start paying more attention to my voice when I'm streaming. But look, it's from the jump. It's fast. Her butt is great. Not this, at least. You've got confetti, you've got loud music, you've got dramatic entrances. Look at this! Look at this! It's fast, it's colorful, it's enticing, and it's over in about a minute. And if you want to ride that ride again, it can cost you, depending on the game, $30. And this presentation has been probably extensively workshopped to get a person to roll again. It is exciting, it is alluring, it's ridiculous, right? And even here I am talking about the attention economy and all of the different nuances of this. Look, I am not immune to cute horse girls. Yeah, and what King Reploy just said too. It's like you only see the golds there. Sometimes they're rainbows. It's even rarer. It's a slot machine that has been designed to captivate and direct your attention and to make you want to continue to spend money on the game. There's a reason the gacha games are what? $1 billion industry? Just in and of themselves? It's ridiculous. And it's understandable, right? It's a losing game. From the moment I click that button to use the free currency that you get from just playing the game, I've already lost. There's a twinge in the back of my brain that says, hey, you could just open up your wallet real quick. You could ride the ride again. So I am not immune either. And I want to put that out there. I think the So you might have heard about this story actually. So companies not only farm data, but also run experiments on people, particularly on social media, whether or not that they are aware of it, right? There was a controversy in the last couple of years about a particular study that happened at Facebook. So the Facebook researchers got together and they decided, you know what we're going to do? We're going to run an experiment with a sample size of 700,000 people, which is absurd. I can't believe you get that many people in a study. And what they decided to do was manipulate the emotional content of those people's Facebook timelines to see if manipulating the person's timeline was a way of changing their mood. So if we show you things that we think are going to make you angry, do you get angry? If we show you things that are happy, do you become happy? So on and so forth. And they wrote this up. They did the research. They published it. It landed in, I want to say, Science, which is about as a slam dunk or grand slam of a paper as you can get. But what really drove up the controversy around this one, though, is that many people weren't aware that they actually took place in the study because it was buried in the EULA that you consented to let Facebook run experiments on, to run experiments on you. And I've been scouted for these jobs. I know people that work there, and it's I've never really felt good about it. We had in grad school when this story broke, we had a very long conversation about the ethics of it, and I was pretty hard on the face that no one reads the EULA. They're running an experiment with the intention of changing people's moods. And their ethical review board, I want to say, was actually internal to Facebook. So basically, Facebook said that Facebook was ethical in doing this research. I felt very weird about it. It was, and it drummed up a lot of controversy, but particularly one of the defenses that Facebook used and the researchers that were behind the project pointed out was that we're not the only people that do this. Everyone's doing this all the time. And they're not wrong. So not only are people with lots of degrees and lots of experience frequently sitting down to think about how they can best direct your attention, sometimes they're actually getting that information by running experiments on people without them being aware of it. It's a very dubious thing for me. I definitely would probably not feel comfortable doing this kind of work. But some of them might justify it to themselves by saying that they're working to fix the attention economy. They're not looking to necessarily make money off of people. They're looking to kind of concede that manipulations of attention, advertising, so on and so forth, are just going to happen. People are going to do it. And we can do it ethically. We can use persuasive techniques to empower people to, quote unquote, like live their best lives. Which I would say, as a person who pretends to be a deer on the internet, what do you mean best life? This is my best life. And as Odell points out, as her criticism of this perspective of sort of ethical persuasion, is that trying to steer people toward things that are good for them is not necessarily outside of a profit motive. It's an attempt to make ethical capitalism real, but if you're also like me, and I've already said this earlier in other videos, I tend to fall on the Marxist materialist side of things. If you're just not changing the material conditions of people, but instead just telling them that you're doing it for their own good, it's still exploitative. And Odell seems to agree with that perspective, that the dynamic of trying to shift people's attention doesn't get less exploitative if you're doing it for their own good based on what you think what is good for them, especially if you're still making money off them in the process. But it does kind of come into a couple of issues that if you're like me and you're trying to get out of the Skinner box that we all live in, there are a couple of things that you can think about. In particular, this assumes a very shallow view of behavior. That is to say that if you remember radical behaviorism in Skinner, the idea that we are sort of stimulus and response machines, that our mental states don't really matter, that's kind of the perspective that underlies this idea of ethical persuasion. That it assumes that people take things at face value, that we are stimulated by things in our environment, that our attention can be directed, and that we don't really have a lot of say in what's happening under the hood, so to speak. And I don't think that's true. And Odell doesn't seem to think so either. And so one of the ways that we can really get around and sort of subvert the attention economy is to get around this shallow assumption of the way that we see ourselves, and that we don't necessarily have to play the game by the rules that are laid out for us. And so the dynamic that Odell brings up is rendering. Particularly, like, if you think about rendering an image, it doesn't necessarily exist in a computer format until you decide to actually make it real. There is an agency in terms of what we choose to depict and how we choose to depict it in an artistic piece, particularly if you're viewing sort of digital or 3D art. And that's true of our attention as well. We can direct our attention to and from different things. We have agency, and we have the ability to be critical of the way that we consume media. You can be aware that you are in the box, and in doing so, acknowledging the box and it might be the first step to being able to create space to get outside of it. And so by exercising and flexing our mental brains, things like being able to selectively attend to certain information, and maybe selectively disattend to particular attempts to direct or manipulate what we are attending to, become easier over time. After all, you can work out at the library and flex them big brain muscles. And it turns out, if you've ever been in a situation where you found something particularly difficult to begin with, particularly trying to focus or attend to something, you might find out that it becomes easier over time. So the way that, or Odell's particular example, kind of closing this chapter, is that, kind of the through line in a lot of this work is Odell's hobby of bird watching. And in this case, the topic of bird watching and learning to selectively attend to birds, even if there is no profit value in doing so, opened up the door for her later interest in bioregionalism, or understanding the connections between flora and fauna in different environments. Shifting her attention toward birds from the I is perspective to the I thou perspective allowed her to extend and expand her attentional capacity into I, it, and I, thou. Thank you for the correction. Thank you. To include a more encompassing understanding of the world that she lived in. And it was a process that she went through, that it wasn't like she just flipped a switch, but it was something she had to learn and practice, and later on became easier over time. So one way to think about this, because I'm always going to close these on forest metaphors, we can use our ability, our conscious perspective, to attend to and understand the world that we live in, to render the forest that we want to see, to get outside of these shallow attempts to manipulate and control what we do or think or feel, and to understand that it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. We can extend and expand the lens of our experience, even if it's hard, through repeated effort and awareness. And so that's sort of the, I guess, the crux of the end of this chapter. And then let's see, the end of chapter 4 leads us into chapter 5, the ecology of strangers, and then later on into, actually, we're coming up into the last couple of chapters here. It looks like there might only be about another 2 weeks of this. So that is that's the reading series for this week. This was a lot of fun for me. I was not sure, like I said, what to make of that after the first couple of chapters, but I had a lot of fun doing this, and it gave me a chance to talk about some of my favorite social psych experiments. So I had fun. So I am going to take a quick break here. And then I'm going to do, I guess, a QA. If people have any questions, or I'll just hang out for a little bit. And then we can call it for a night. How's that sound? Yeah, a lot of interesting stuff this week. I imagine there will be interesting stuff next week as well. Let's see, let's get to that good Dova syndrome. And I am going to put this up on YouTube. So with a little bit of editing, probably sometime tomorrow. And beyond that, I'll be back. Just enjoy these some chill music while I go get another glass of water, and then we can chill for a little bit. It'll be fun. Make it a little bit more casual. Maybe I'll get another drink. All right. Peace, peace.